Along the rocky Massachusetts coast, where fog rolls in thick and the sea winds carry secrets, there's a broken stone marker almost hidden by weeds. Most people won't go near it. Fishermen cross themselves when they sail past, and even historians, who love digging up the past, keep quiet about what it means. All that's carved into the stone? A single date, 1687, and two names that once froze entire communities with fear, Ezekiel and Judith Harrington. For nearly 20 years, this brother and sister built their wealth on blood, accusation, and the cries of the innocent. But when their twisted legacy gave birth to children so deformed that even hardened doctors refused to look at them, people whispered that God himself had finally struck back. What really happened inside that isolated manor, where two brilliant but terrifying 8-year-old twins plotted against their own parents, was buried under fear, superstition, and silence. Until now. Before we go deeper into the Harrington story, make sure you're subscribed and have that notification bell on. Trust me, the tales we share here aren't the ones you'll find in your school history books. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because dark stories like this one hide in every corner of America. Let's rewind. Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1660s. Life was brutal. Small fishing villages and farming towns scraped by on little, hemmed in by pine forests and rocky shores. And everywhere, fear. Fear of the devil, fear of witchcraft, fear that your neighbor might be in league with Satan. And in one of these towns, Wickham's Harbor, barely 300 souls, two siblings were about to use that fear like a weapon. Ezekiel Harrington, 28, sharp features, gray eyes that could cut through you. His younger sister, Judith, 25, cold, striking, with a voice that dripped poison disguised as piety. Together they weren't just dangerous, they were unstoppable. Their father, a failed Boston merchant, had at least given them one gift before dying of fever in 1663: education. They could read, write, and, most importantly, understood property law, which meant they knew exactly how to twist a trial into profit. When their parents passed, they were left with almost nothing but debts. Most people would have taken up farming or trade, but not Ezekiel and Judith. They saw opportunity in the growing hysteria over witchcraft. Their first job took them to the village of Milford, a 2-day ride inland. The crops had failed. Animals were stillborn. The people were desperate for answers. Ezekiel arrived as the expert witch finder. Judith, his silent assistant, claimed skill in spotting the devil's hidden marks. Their process was cruel but effective. Find the wealthiest, most envied person in town, then accuse them. Their first victim was Constance Fletcher, a widow who had inherited a profitable grain mill. Local men wanted it. The Harringtons made sure they got it. The evidence was all manufactured. Strange marks on her body, inflicted by the siblings themselves during a forced examination. Neighbors remembering suspicious mutterings, planted by Judith's whispers. And the most damning fact: her mill kept producing when others didn't, because she took care of it. On November 15th, 1664, Constance Fletcher was hanged. Her property divided between the town and the Harringtons. That was just the start. Over the next 15 years, they traveled across New England, stirring suspicion, fueling paranoia, and handpicking victims. 8 different communities, 57 innocent people dead, and each trial padded their growing fortune. By 1675, the siblings were unimaginably rich for the time. More than 15,000 pounds in assets, land in 9 towns, mortgages on dozens of farms. But with wealth came a problem: how to keep it. Marriage in that era wasn't just romance, it was law. If Ezekiel or Judith married someone else, that spouse would gain rights to the fortune. If either died without direct heirs, distant relatives or even the government might seize everything. The solution? Cold, calculated, and horrifying. They would marry each other, believe it or not. Colonial law allowed sibling marriages under certain exceptional circumstances, and the Harringtons made sure to exploit it. On December 21st, 1675, the winter solstice, they wed in secret in the basement of their manor. The only witnesses were a corrupt minister bought with bribes during a Salem trial, and 2 terrified servants sworn to silence. To the outside world, they remained unmarried, a bachelor and a spinster, devoted to God's work. But in truth, their unholy union bound their fortune, their secrets, and their crimes together. And that's only the beginning. Because what came next, their children, their downfall, and the curse that still lingers in the shadows of Massachusetts makes everything you've just heard sound almost tame. The Harrington wedding was never meant to be a celebration of love. It was a mockery of Christian vows, carried out not to honor God but to lock down wealth and hide secrets too dangerous to share. And for a while it seemed to work. By early 1676, Judith was pregnant. The siblings, cold and calculating as ever, treated the pregnancy as proof that their unholy pact had been the right decision. The first months passed without issue, nothing unusual, no warning signs. They even spared no expense to ensure perfection. A midwife from Boston, one of the best in the colonies, was hired at an extravagant fee. Exotic foods were brought in, imported medicines stocked, and in a move dripping with arrogance, Ezekiel commissioned twin mahogany cradles lined with silk, as if destiny had already chosen heirs worthy of an empire. But then came the 7th month. That's when the first shadows appeared. Judith began feeling movements unlike anything she or the midwife had ever known. Not the gentle kicks of ordinary babies, no. These were sharp, violent, almost coordinated. The midwife, Sarah Wheatham, who had delivered more than 300 children in her lifetime, whispered to her assistant, Emma Prescott, that it felt as though the unborn twins were fighting each other inside the womb. Ezekiel brushed off the warning, calling it superstition. Outwardly, he played the skeptic, but in private, he grew uneasy. He buried himself in medical texts, buying up every book he could find across the colonies. He sent letters to doctors in London and Edinburgh begging for insight. He interviewed midwives from other settlements, searching for answers. The information he uncovered gave him hope and dread. Yes, some texts noted that twins often fought in the womb, struggling for space and survival. But the same books also carried chilling warnings. Children born of close blood relations often suffered stillbirths, deformities, or mental impairment. And then came the birth. On March 15, 1677, labor began. It lasted nearly 2 agonizing days. The midwife Sarah Wheatham would never forget it. What emerged from Judith's body were not ordinary children. They were something no one in the room had ever seen. Twins, boys twisted and malformed, their limbs bent at impossible angles, their skulls jutted with unnatural ridges. Tissue bridges seemed to connect their bodies, perhaps even sharing organs. It should have been horrifying enough, but what made Sarah and Emma recoil in terror wasn't just their appearance, it was their awareness. The newborns moved with purpose. They grasped at objects. They seemed to communicate with each other through strange sounds and gestures. Within hours of life, they displayed a level of intelligence far beyond what should have been possible. Ezekiel and Judith, terrified of what people might say, named them Gabriel and Raphael, biblical names, a shield against accusations of unnatural evil. Against all odds, the twins survived those early days. And then, they thrived. By their first birthday, their minds were already astonishing their parents. Their bodies remained grotesquely limited. They couldn't walk like normal children, couldn't play in the usual ways. But their minds were something else entirely. By the age of 4, Gabrielle and Raphael had taught themselves to read. By 5, they could work through mathematics beyond the skills of most adults in their village. By 7, they were holding philosophical conversations that could have stumped university scholars. And on their 8th birthday in 1685, they were something truly unprecedented in colonial America. Children who looked like monsters but thought like prodigies. Yet this brilliance brought with it a dangerous awareness. Because while their parents thought they were keeping them hidden from the world, they had also kept them inside the manor, close enough to overhear everything. The Harringtons believed their sons were too young, too disabled, too trapped in their own bodies to understand. So they spoke freely in their presence. They planned their schemes. They reviewed their records. They whispered about bribes, forged evidence, and the deaths of innocents. And all the while, Gabriel and Raphael listened, silent, still, watching. By 1685, the twins didn't just understand their parents' crimes, they had memorized them. Every false accusation, every name, every stolen property, they knew it all, and that mistake would be the beginning of Ezekiel and Judith Harrington's downfall. What happened next? How these unnerving children turned their parents' empire of fear against them would shock everyone involved. What if you discovered that the pain you carried since birth wasn't fate, but punishment for someone else's greed. That's exactly what Gabriel and Raphael Harrington realized. Their twisted bodies weren't the result of God's judgment or random chance. No, it was because their parents had chosen to marry within their own bloodline, all to keep their criminal empire safe. And once the twins understood that truth, something inside them lit up, rage, grief, and a determination that burned brighter than anyone expected. They couldn't walk. They struggled to speak. They were completely dependent on Ezekiel and Judith Harrington, their powerful parents. Yet they were already planning how to expose them. Their chance came in the summer of 1685. That's when a young woman named Margaret Caldwell arrived at the Harrington Manor, looking for work as a servant. Margaret's past was tragic. Her father, Thomas Caldwell, had been executed for witchcraft 6 years earlier. What she didn't know was that the Harringtons had been the ones to orchestrate the whole thing. They wanted his forge, his land, and they got it by destroying her family. To Margaret, the Harringtons were still wealthy, respected members of the community. But once she stepped into their house, she began to uncover the truth that would shake all of colonial America. And the way the twins reached out to her, it was both heartbreaking and brilliant. Gabriel and Raphael could barely form words, but they'd figured out how to leave written notes for Margaret, tucked away where she'd find them while cleaning. At first, the messages were small, hints about hidden documents, odd financial records. But soon they grew bolder, more detailed, pointing Margaret straight toward the evidence that could unravel their parents' empire. Even more incredible, the twins learned to recognize the Harringtons' dangerous visitors. They warned Margaret when particularly violent associates were coming, saving her from walking straight into death traps. Then came the turning point, September 1685. The boys directed Margaret to Ezekiel's study. Behind a false wall, she found what every victim's family had been praying for: ledgers. Detailed financial records covering 15 years of blood money. Each page revealed the horror: payments for witch trials, confiscated properties, estimated values, witness fees. It was all there. Proof that the Harringtons had been murdering innocent people for profit. But finding the evidence put Margaret in mortal danger. She knew if they caught her, she'd be next, so she played it smart. Instead of running or confronting them, she began quietly copying the most damning documents. At the same time, she sought help from someone outside the Harringtons' reach: Father Benedict Thorne, a Jesuit priest newly arrived from France. At first, Father Thorne doubted her. But once he saw the copies, the ledgers, the witness lists, the property maps, his skepticism turned to horror. This wasn't a few isolated crimes. This was an empire built on systematic murder and theft. Thorne was uniquely qualified to see what others would miss. He wasn't just a priest. He was trained in both theology and natural philosophy. He knew how to recognize deception, and he understood the spiritual and psychological rot left behind by evil. By October 1685, Father Thorne made his move. He arrived at the Harrington Manor under the guise of a friendly pastoral visit, just a priest meeting a prominent family. Ezekiel and Judith welcomed him eagerly, hoping to manipulate him like they had so many others. But this time, they'd underestimated their guest. The moment Father Thorne stepped inside, he sensed it. Not ghosts, not demons, but the heavy, suffocating residue of decades of murder. He asked to meet the twins, claiming it was out of pastoral concern. In truth, he needed to know if Margaret's reports were right. Did Gabriel and Raphael truly understand enough to testify against their parents? What he discovered would set into motion one of the greatest scandals in colonial American history, and that was only the beginning. When Father Benedict Thorne finally stepped inside the children's chambers, he found something far more haunting than Margaret had ever described. Gabriel and Raphael were frail, their bodies twisted with pain. Yet behind their suffering burned sharp intelligence, emotional depth, and a kind of maturity you'd never expect from children so isolated. And here's what chilled Father Thorne the most. The twins weren't afraid of him. Not at all. Instead, they looked at him with something closer to relief. Maybe even hope. It was as if they'd been waiting their entire lives for someone strong enough to stand against their parents. They tried desperately to communicate, pointing, gesturing, straining to form words. Anything to share what they'd seen. Crimes committed, evidence hidden, secrets destroyed. Father Thorne had been trained to comfort victims of cruelty and persecution. But this was different. He'd counseled survivors before, adults who could speak for themselves. These children? They were trapped, bound to the very people who had caused their suffering, their own parents. When Thorne left the manor that day, his face showed nothing but polite calm. Yet both sides knew the truth. The first real battle had begun. He had seen enough to confirm his darkest suspicions, and Ezekiel and Judith had seen enough in him to recognize a threat unlike any they had ever faced. Back in Boston, Thorne wasted no time. He launched a quiet but devastating investigation, backed by the Catholic Church's vast network. Unlike the clumsy colonial courts, the Church had methods, sophisticated ways to gather evidence, cross-check testimony, and take down even the most powerful. Within 3 weeks, Thorne had built a complete case file on the Harrington siblings' bank records, testimonies from victims' families, and most explosive of all, a confession from Marcus Fletcher, a former accomplice. Fletcher spilled everything. How the Harringtons picked their targets, how they forged evidence, how they bribed officials to guarantee guilty verdicts. And then came the darkest revelation. The Harringtons hadn't just married each other to protect their wealth. They deliberately brought children into the world knowing the risks of incest. And even worse, they planned to exploit their own son's suffering, displaying Gabriel and Raphael as curiosities for the rich and powerful, and selling their case notes to European doctors obsessed with the effects of inbreeding. But the real turning point was still the children themselves. Despite everything they'd endured, Gabriel and Raphael had astonishingly clear memories. They remembered conversations. They remembered evidence being moved or destroyed. And when Father Thorne carefully interviewed them in secret visits arranged by Margaret Caldwell, their testimony backed up the documents and Fletcher's confession, and then came horrors no one was prepared for. The twins revealed they had been test subjects in their parents' twisted experiments. Painful medical procedures with no anesthesia, cruel intellectual tests where food and comfort were withheld as punishment. Years of being treated like lab animals. Also, Ezekiel and Judith could prove their theories about deformity, intelligence, and bloodlines. Every detail was logged. Every torment written down to be sold to Europe's physicians. By the end of 1685, the Harrington Manor had become a pressure cooker. The siblings' empire of blood and lies was collapsing under the weight of evidence. Thorne now had proof strong enough to expose them, but one wrong move could put the children, and every witness, at deadly risk. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Raphael refused to stay silent. From their isolated rooms, they kept documenting what no one else could see, hiding away scraps of evidence, recording their parents' conversations, building their own secret archive to bring the Harringtons down. What came next would shake the colonies to their core. What happens when children, broken in body but sharper in mind than anyone imagined, turn their parents' own cruelty against them? That's exactly what began inside Harrington Manor in the winter of 1685. Ezekiel and Judith had started to suspect something wasn't right. Their children, Gabriel and Raphael, were showing signs of defiance, of awareness far beyond what they should have had. But instead of love, instead of pride, the parents felt only fear. Fear that their own offspring could unravel everything. The breaking point came in early December. Ezekiel discovered something terrifying. Someone had been rifling through his most secret financial ledgers. Scratch marks on the false wall, hinges disturbed, dust patterns shifted. Even more damning, pages marked with faint pencil dots, as if someone had been carefully studying the most incriminating evidence. At first, suspicion fell on Margaret Caldwell. She was the obvious choice, the servant girl with reasons to hate them. So Ezekiel and Judith interrogated her brutally, using the same cruel methods that had broken so many accused witches. Margaret did know things, but not everything. And soon the siblings realized someone else was behind the breaches. What they couldn't grasp was the unthinkable truth. Their own children had been systematically collecting evidence against them for months. The parents' blindness, treating the twins as helpless, harmless, would prove their greatest mistake. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Raphael pressed on, growing bolder by the day. They'd invented clever systems to communicate and plan in secret, scribbled notes, coded sounds, even moving household objects in subtle ways. Their twisted bodies might have held them down, but their minds had been sharpened into weapons. By mid-December, the twins had built an archive of horrors. not just past crimes, but future ones. They learned Ezekiel and Judith were plotting to expand into the Connecticut River Valley, where fear of Indian raids could be twisted into profitable witchcraft accusations. Worse still, they overheard plans for their own deaths. Their parents saw them now as liabilities. Accidents could happen, especially to disabled children in the dead of winter, and preparations were already being made. The boys knew then time was running out, but instead of panicking, Gabriel and Raphael turned to strategy. They wouldn't run. They wouldn't just whisper warnings, no. They would force their parents to expose themselves publicly, fatally. And the stage? December 21st, 1685, the 10th anniversary of Ezekiel and Judith's secret wedding. A night the siblings always celebrated as their own dark holiday, a twisted ritual honoring their partnership in crime. That private celebration would become the perfect backdrop for the twins' final move. Think about that for a second. Two children, barely 8 years old, facing certain death, and yet planning with the clarity of seasoned investigators. They knew their bodies couldn't save them, but their minds, their courage, and their determination for justice could. What unfolded on that night was the culmination of months of hidden work, tiny acts of defiance that had built into a masterstroke of survival, and the horror that followed would bring the Harrington empire crashing down. What if the very children you thought were weak, broken, and harmless turned out to be the ones who destroyed you? That's the chilling reality Ezekiel and Judith Harrington were about to face in the winter of 1685. For years, they believed their twin sons, Gabriel and Raphael, were nothing more than fragile dependents, helpless, silent witnesses at best. But in truth, the boys had been watching, listening, and planning. They knew their parents' habits inside out, their greed, their cruelty, even the exact rituals they performed during their so-called anniversary celebrations. And that knowledge became their greatest weapon. December 21st. The manor was heavy with tension. Upstairs, Ezekiel and Judith prepared to mark their 10th wedding anniversary the same way they always did, counting stolen wealth, reading through lists of victims, and mapping out new schemes. But this year was different. They weren't just celebrating, they were preparing to disappear. Property in Massachusetts was being sold off, documents forged, identities prepared. Their next destination? The Carolina colonies, far away from suspicion and ripe for exploitation. Downstairs, confined to their chambers, Gabriel and Raphael were ready. They had spent months turning themselves into master conspirators. Evidence was hidden all over the house. Forged copies of financial ledgers, maps of stolen land, written testimony of crimes. And more than that, the boys had studied architecture from their father's own library, learning to weaken parts of the manor's structure itself. Their survival depended on precision, timing, and courage. They weren't alone. Father Thorne, a priest with a soldier's background, had been working alongside them. For weeks he studied the manor's layout, scouted escape routes, and set up a secret system of light signals with the boys. He wasn't just coming to pray, he was bringing the law with him, and he knew there would only be one chance. So when the clock struck 7 Oshu, the knock on Harrington Manor's door wasn't a friendly visit. It was the beginning of the end. Inside, Ezekiel and Judith reacted with their usual arrogance. For decades, they'd brushed off suspicion with lies and charm. Why should this time be any different? But something about Father Thorne unnerved them. His confidence, his pointed questions, the way he seemed to know their household a little too well. And then came his request, the fatal moment. He asked to see Gabriel and Raphael. Normally, the Harringtons would have refused. They always claimed the boys were too delicate, too easily disturbed. But now, refusing felt dangerous, suspicious. So, reluctantly, they agreed. That single decision shattered everything. The moment the priest stepped into the children's chamber, Ezekiel and Judith trailing behind, Gabriel and Raphael sprang into action. Using the signal system they had arranged, they began to speak. Their voices were strained, twisted by their condition, but the words carried a force no one could ignore. On September 14th, 1679, Gabriel began slowly. Our father and mother met Marcus Fletcher in the cellar to plan the accusation of Thomas Caldwell. Dates, names, places, silver coins from stolen jewelry, a puppet hidden under an anvil. Every detail laid bare. Raphael picked up seamlessly, his tone steady despite the weight of the revelation. The puppet contained hair taken from Caldwell's youngest daughter, placed there so it would be found during the search. It was like a dagger twisting with every sentence. Imagine it, your most guarded secrets, spoken aloud by the very children you thought powerless. In front of a priest who wasn't just listening but documenting everything, Ezekiel and Judith's composure cracked. For the first time in 2 decades, they had no script, no defense, no escape, and the twins weren't done. They had memorized years of crimes, past betrayals, current schemes, even their parents' plan to flee south and erase their history. This wasn't just confession, it was demolition. What if the truth about your parents wasn't just dark, but monstrous? That's exactly what Gabriel and Raphael Harrington revealed on the night their family's empire finally crumbled. The twins didn't just accuse their parents of cruelty. They laid out everything, hidden stashes of stolen goods, bribery networks that had shielded Ezekiel and Judith for decades, and even the names of victims so well concealed that no one had ever suspected murder. In the chest beneath the study floorboards, Raphael said, his voice steadying with each word, there are 37 pieces of jewelry stolen from executed women, including the wedding ring of Mary Hutchins, hanged in 1681. Gabriel picked up without missing a beat. Mary Hutchins was innocent. Father poisoned her cow, then claimed witchcraft. She lost her life, her land, her husband's blacksmith tools, all parceled out to the town and to our parents as payment. The accuracy was stunning, the details undeniable. Combined with the boys' condition and their sheer intelligence, it was a case no one could ignore. Father Thorne hadn't come unprepared. He brought legal authority, credible witnesses, and scribes ready to record every word. Every revelation was captured, preserved, evidence that couldn't be twisted or erased. But Ezekiel and Judith, they showed no remorse, no fear, no humanity. Instead, they calculated, coldly, instantly. First, they tried to dismiss the boys' words as the delusions of disabled children. But when Thorne presented documents, corroborating testimony and proof from other witnesses, that defense collapsed instantly. So the Harringtons moved to their backup plan, one they'd been perfecting for years: hidden weapons, escape routes, funds ready to fuel a flight into ungoverned territory. The violence came fast, but Gabriel and Raphael had been waiting for it. When Ezekiel drew a pistol, the gun misfired. Shredded by tiny metal fragments Gabriel had slipped inside weeks earlier. The explosion crippled him before he could fire a shot. Judith lunged with a knife, but the floor betrayed her. Boards loosened by Raphael's careful planning snapped under her weight, sending her crashing down and triggering mechanical traps that sealed doors and windows, every escape cut off. The battle moved into the main hall. That's where the twins' grand design came to life. For months they had weakened beams, calculated collapse points, and created safe pockets of space. When their parents made one last desperate charge, the children activated their final defense. The manor came down. It wasn't chaos, it was precision. Ezekiel and Judith were crushed beneath massive timbers. Gabriel, Raphael, Father Thorne, and the rescuers sheltered in a reinforced alcove, exactly as the twins had planned. The destruction did more than kill their parents. It cracked open the manor's darkest secrets, hidden rooms, caches of stolen wealth, piles of documents, and even the skeletal remains of victims no one knew existed. The house that had been a prison for 8 long years was gone, and in its ashes stood something new: freedom. When rescuers finally dug through the wreckage, the sight was unforgettable. Ezekiel and Judith, dead, faces frozen in disbelief. Children they had underestimated had destroyed them. Gabriel and Raphael, alive. Broken bodies but unbroken spirits, and ready to keep talking. Their testimony carried enormous weight. It wasn't just the crimes of 2 killers. It was proof that corruption had poisoned the entire judicial system. Within days, the courts issued posthumous convictions. 57 murders, dozens of counts of fraud, bribery, conspiracy. Legal scholars would later call it the most extensive prosecution in colonial America. But the fallout didn't stop there. Investigations spread across New England. Other witch trials, other verdicts, suddenly questioned. The Harrington case forced everyone to confront an ugly truth. Witchcraft accusations had been twisted for money, power, and greed. Reform followed. Slowly, yes, but steadily. Skepticism grew, and the age of blind persecution began to die. The financial empire Ezekiel and Judith had built was dismantled piece by piece. Over 25,000 in stolen property traced, seized, and redistributed. Farms, homes, tools, wealth, all clawed back for the families of the dead. Records pulled from the ruins revealed just how methodical the Harringtons had been. Lists of victims, maps of stolen estates, bribed officials, even plans for future crimes in the Carolinas. It was industrialized murder, an empire of blood and lies, and at the heart of it all, 2 children who should have never survived. Dr. William Harvey, a royal physician, examined them and confirmed the truth. Their helplessness had been exaggerated by neglect. With food, care, therapy, they began to recover. Their minds, already brilliant, flourished. They read faster than adults, solved complex math, sketched, composed, created. Scholars marveled. The twins weren't cursed. They were extraordinary. Their testimony remained essential, dismantling networks of accomplices and exposing hidden rot across the colonies. More than that, their resilience became a symbol, proof that even in the darkest conditions, truth and justice could endure. The fall of Harrington Manor shook Massachusetts to its core. It rewrote law, exposed corruption, and challenged centuries of prejudice against both disability and supposed witchcraft. And it happened because 2 children refused to stay silent. What if I told you 2 children, born into horror, grew up to change the very systems that once betrayed them? Gabriel and Raphael Harrington were once hidden away, treated as curiosities, even feared for their physical condition. But here's the twist. Their brilliance, their calm dignity, and their sheer determination eventually forced people to see them not as monsters, but as human beings with extraordinary gifts. Their story didn't just shift how people viewed them. It transformed how society thought about disability, justice, and the very meaning of human potential. Gabriel, against all odds, became a legal mind that reshaped colonial courts. His writings on evidence, protecting witnesses, and fighting corruption left marks that lasted for generations. He personally pushed for procedures that protected child witnesses and people with disabilities, protections inspired by his own suffering as a child silenced by abusive parents. His work helped build entire court systems designed to safeguard the vulnerable. Raphael's path was different, but just as groundbreaking. He became a physician, dedicated to children with physical differences and survivors of abuse. Unlike most doctors of the time, Raphael treated his patients as whole people, not experiments or burdens. His approach focused on dignity, education, and reintegration into society. He even founded the first school in colonial America for children with disabilities. Imagine that, a school proving that so-called limitations didn't mean intellectual failure. His vision spread, inspiring more schools and changing the way communities thought about disability forever. And what about their personal lives? Both brothers married. Both built families free of the darkness that cursed their childhood. Their children were healthy, showing no trace of the genetic and moral corruption of their grandparents. That fact alone shattered the assumption that their suffering was destined to continue. Their happy families stood as living proof that trauma doesn't have to define the rest of a life. The ripple effects didn't end with them. Father Thorne, the man who exposed their parents, documented everything. His careful investigations became the blueprint for how later courts and churches handled cases against the powerful. His reports turned into essential reading for legal scholars and clergy alike, shaping the very idea of accountability in colonial America. Even the Harrington estate itself became a kind of lesson. The manor was left in ruins, preserved as a grim memorial. A single stone marker stands there, with chilling words chosen by Gabriel and Raphael themselves. Evil is not supernatural. It is a human choice. Justice depends on the courage of those who refuse to remain silent. Think about that. Their story wasn't just survival. It became a weapon against corruption, superstition, and abuse. It forced people to face the truth. Children, no matter how fragile or different, still carry dignity, intelligence, and moral strength that must be protected. The Harrington legacy reshaped ideas about childhood, disability, and human rights. It showed that resilience is possible even in the darkest circumstances. and that communities can't afford to hide behind fear and superstition when injustice is staring them in the face. But here's the chilling part. Ezekiel and Judith Harrington thrived for nearly 2 decades, not because they were supernatural demons, but because they knew exactly how to exploit fear, greed, and silence. Their downfall came not from divine judgment, but from people who finally stood up and refused to look away. So let me ask you, do you think the Harringtons were unique? Or were there others in colonial America, other so-called witch hunters, using superstition as cover for murder and profit? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this tale left you shaken, hit like, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe. There are more dark stories from America's past waiting for you. And trust me, the next one is even harder to believe.